Tombstone, Arizona Territory. October 30, 6:47 a.m. The desert wind carried whispers of death that morning, cutting through the wooden shanties and canvas tents of Tombstone like a blade through bone. Frost clung to the sagebrush despite the promise of another scorching day ahead. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl pierced the pre-dawn silence, a sound that would later haunt the dreams of those who survived to remember. In the shadows of Murphy's saloon, 7 men gathered around a table scarred by knife fights and stained with blood that had never quite washed clean. The amber glow of an oil lamp flickered across their faces, revealing features hardened by years of running, killing, and surviving in a land that forgave nothing and forgot even less. Zephyr Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his pale eyes reflecting the flame like chips of ice. At 34, he was the eldest of the group, a man whose reputation preceded him through every territory west of the Mississippi. The newspapers called him the Phantom of the Frontier, a ghost who appeared without warning, struck without mercy, and vanished without a trace. His black hair hung past his shoulders, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a cavalry saber that had failed to kill him in Gettysburg. "Gentlemen," Blackwood's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it commanded absolute attention. "Today we ride into legend." To his right sat Caspian Thornfield, 28 years old and deadly as a diamondback. His fingers, long and elegant as a pianist's, drummed against the table's edge, the same fingers that could draw and fire a Colt .45 faster than most men could blink. Thornfield had been educated at Harvard before a gambling debt and a dead man in Boston sent him fleeing west. Now his refined accent seemed mockingly out of place in the crude saloon. "The Cortez shipment," Thornfield murmured, his voice carrying traces of Massachusetts nobility. 40,000 in gold bars, traveling the old Apache Trail. It's madness, Zeph, pure madness. Across from him, Orion Graves laughed, a sound like bones rattling in a coffin. At 25, Graves was the youngest but perhaps the most ruthless. His auburn hair caught the lamplight, and his green eyes held the kind of cold calculation that made even hardened outlaws uncomfortable. They said Graves had killed his first man at 14, his own father, and had been adding to his tally ever since.
Madness. Graves leaned forward, his smile sharp as a razor. Or the greatest score in the history of the territories. 40,000 could set us up for life, boys. Real life, not this hand-to-mouth existence.
Beside him, the massive form of Atlas Stoneheart shifted in his chair, which groaned under his 300-pound frame. Standing 6'8", Stoneheart was a mountain of muscle and scar tissue, his bald head marked with symbols he'd carved himself during his years as a Buffalo Soldier before desertion, and a string of murders made him an outlaw. His dark skin bore the brands of slavery, and his eyes held the fury of a man who had been broken and rebuilt himself into something far more dangerous. "Atlas don't care about the money." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Atlas cares about the killing. Been too long since we had a real fight." The 5th member of their group, Lysander Pike, cleaned his fingernails with a bone-handled knife, his movements precise and almost surgical. Pike was thin as a scarecrow, with hollow cheeks and eyes the color of dried blood. At 31, he served as the group's tracker and scout, but his true talent lay in torture. Pike could keep a man alive and screaming for days, extracting secrets with the patience of a craftsman perfecting his art. "The Apache Trail," Pike mused, his voice soft and sibilant. "Haven't been through there since the massacre at Devil's Canyon. They say the spirits of the dead still walk those rocks, looking for revenge." "Superstitious nonsense," scoffed Galileo Ravenwood, though his hand unconsciously moved to the silver cross hanging around his neck. At 29, Ravenwood was their explosives expert, a former mining engineer who'd turned to robbery when a cave-in killed his entire crew and drove him to drink and despair. His red beard was streaked with premature gray, and his blue eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much death. "Maybe so," Ravenwood continued. But that trail's dangerous for more than spirits. Flash floods, rock slides, and those caves. Christ, those caves go down forever. A man could get lost in there and never find his way out. The seventh and final member of their brotherhood had remained silent throughout the discussion. Mordecai Ironwood sat motionless in the shadows, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat that he never removed. At 41, Ironwood was older than even Blackwood, and infinitely more mysterious. No one knew his full story, where he'd come from, what crimes had driven him to join their ranks. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was usually to deliver death. The twin Remington revolvers on his hips had never been drawn in vain, and some whispered that Ironwood wasn't entirely human, that he'd made a bargain with darker forces. Now Ironwood's voice emerged from the shadows like smoke from a funeral pyre. The gold is cursed. The table fell silent. Even the ambient sounds of the saloon, the creaking of wood, the scurrying of rats, seemed to pause in anticipation. Blackwood leaned forward. "Explain." Ironwood's head tilted slightly, revealing a glimpse of pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones. "Spanish gold, taken from the Aztec temples 3 centuries ago, bathed in the blood of innocents and blessed by dark priests. Every man who touches it meets a grim end." Graves laughed, but the sound was hollow. More superstition. "Gold is gold, boys. Cursed or not, it will spend just the same." "Will it?" Ironwood's voice carried an edge that made the others shift uncomfortably. "Ask the miners who first discovered it in the Superstition Mountains. All 7 of them found dead, their eyes burned out from the inside. Ask Captain Mendoza, who commanded the first escort. They found him 3 days after the shipment disappeared, aged 50 years overnight, his hair white as snow and his mind shattered." Thornfield adjusted his vest nervously. "Coincidence? The desert plays tricks on weak minds." "Perhaps." Ironwood's fingers drummed once against the table, a sound like bones knocking together. "But the gold remembers, and it calls to those who would possess it, promising wealth beyond measure. But the price," he trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Blackwood studied each of his men in turn. They were killers, thieves, and outcasts. But they were his killers, thieves, and outcasts. For 3 years they'd ridden together, pulling off scores from California to Kansas, always staying one step ahead of the law and their enemies. They'd earned a reputation as the most dangerous gang in the territories, men who showed no mercy and left no witnesses. "The choice is yours," Blackwood said finally. "Any man who wants to walk away can do so now, no questions asked. But once we ride out, there's no turning back. We see this through to the end, whatever that might be." One by one, the men nodded their agreement. Greed, desperation, or simple loyalty, whatever motivated them, they were committed. Then it settled. Blackwood stood, his shadow stretching across the table like a dark omen. "We ride at dawn. Pike, what's the latest on the shipment's route?" Pike consulted a piece of paper covered with his spidery handwriting. "Left Phoenix 3 days ago under heavy guard. 12 cavalry soldiers plus a detachment of civilian scouts. They are taking the northern route through Skull Valley, then cutting south toward the Apache Trail." "Numbers?" Thornfield asked. 20 men total, but only half are soldiers. The rest are hired guns, good with their weapons but lacking military discipline." Atlas Stoneheart cracked his knuckles, the sound like branches breaking. 20 men. Atlas likes those odds. "Don't underestimate them," Blackwood warned. "Major Harrison is leading the escort, and he's no fool. Fought at Bull Run and Shiloh, earned his rank in blood. He will be expecting trouble." Ravenwood leaned forward, his engineer's mind already working on the problem. "What about the terrain? Where's our best chance for an ambush?" Pike spread a hand-drawn map across the table, his finger tracing the route. "Here," he said, tapping a point where the trail narrowed between 2 steep canyon walls. "Devil's Throat, the perfect killing ground. They will have to string out single file, and there's no way to retreat quickly. And if things go wrong? Thornfield asked. Pike's finger moved further south, to where the map showed a complex network of caves and canyons, the Whispering Caves. We can lose any pursuit in there. Wait them out. Local Apache avoid the place. Say it's haunted by the spirits of an entire tribe that disappeared centuries ago. Ironwood's head turned sharply at the mention of the caves, though his face remained hidden. The caves are dangerous, more dangerous than any posse. Why? Graves asked, though something in his voice suggested he didn't really want to know. Because some places in this world are meant to remain empty, Ironwood replied. Some darkness is better left undisturbed. The room fell silent again, the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on them like a physical force. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing through the streets of Tombstone. Blackwood checked his pocket watch, a silver timepiece taken from a banker in Tucson who died begging for his life. Gentlemen, I suggest we get some rest. Tomorrow begins the greatest adventure of our lives. As the men filed out of the saloon into the pre-dawn darkness, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. Martha Blackwood, no relation to their leader, despite the shared name, had been tracking the gang for 6 months. Ever since they'd killed her husband during a bank robbery in Silver City, she was a woman driven by grief and vengeance, and she'd sworn on her husband's grave that she'd see every one of them hang. Now, as she watched them separate and head to their respective lodgings, Martha made her own preparations. She had friends among the cavalry, and a telegraph message could reach Major Harrison's column within hours. The trap could become the trapped if she played her cards right. But as she hurried toward the telegraph office, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that forces larger than mere human vengeance were at work. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers in a language she didn't recognize, and something that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The 7 outlaws sat their horses in a line on the ridge overlooking Tombstone, their silhouettes dark against the burning sky. Each man was armed to the teeth, rifles, pistols, knives, and ammunition, enough for a small war. Their horses were the finest money could steal, strong, fast animals that could cover vast distances without rest. Blackwood rode a magnificent black stallion named Nightmare, a beast as temperamental and dangerous as its master. Thornfield preferred a gray mare with the speed of the wind and the endurance of stone. Graves had chosen a paint horse that seemed to match his wild nature, while Atlas Stoneheart's mount was a massive draft horse, the only animal capable of carrying his enormous frame. Pike rode a nervous sorrel that reflected his own twitchy energy, and Ravenwood sat astride a solid bay that had carried him through countless narrow escapes. But it was Ironwood's horse that drew the most attention, a pale animal that seemed almost translucent in the desert light, its eyes holding an intelligence that was somehow disturbing. Last chance, Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Any man who wants to turn back can do so now. The only response was the sound of wind through the scrub brush and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then we ride. Blackwood spurred his horse forward, and the 7 outlaws descended from the ridge like the 4 horsemen multiplied, their passage marked by dust clouds that rose like smoke signals against the endless blue sky. Behind them, Tombstone continued its daily routine, unaware that 7 of the most dangerous men in the territories had just embarked on their final journey. The town would remember them. In time, remember the day they rode out and never came back. Remember the mystery that would haunt the desert for generations to come. But ahead lay the Sonoran Desert, vast and merciless, where the sun could kill a man in hours and the night could freeze him solid. Ahead lay Apache warriors who knew every rock and waterhole for 100 miles. Ahead lay the gold-laden convoy, heavily guarded and alert for trouble. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, the dark mouths of the Whispering Caves waited like hungry mouths, ready to swallow whatever the desert chose to feed them. The outlaws had ridden through the night, following game trails and dry washes that would hide their passage from any pursuit. Pike's knowledge of the desert was encyclopedic. He knew every water source, every hidden canyon, every place where a man could take shelter from the killing sun or the freezing wind. Now they crouched behind a ridge of red sandstone, looking down into the narrow canyon known as Devil's Throat. The Apache Trail ran straight through the middle, barely wide enough for two horses to pass abreast. Steep walls rose on either side, pocked with caves and ledges that would provide perfect cover for an ambush. "There," Pike whispered, pointing toward the eastern entrance of the canyon. "They will come through at first light, trying to make time while it's still cool." Blackwood studied the terrain through his spyglass, noting every detail. Positions. Thornfield and Graves. Take the north wall. Atlas and Ravenwood. The south. Pike, you are with me at the western exit. We will cut off their retreat. Ironwood. He turned to look for the seventh member of their group, but Ironwood had vanished. One moment he'd been there, silent as always, and the next he was gone like smoke. Where the hell Graves began? "He's scouting," Blackwood said, though he sounded less certain than usual. "Ironwood has his own methods." The truth was, none of them truly understood Mordecai Ironwood. He appeared and disappeared at will, seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know, and had abilities that defied explanation. But he was useful, and in their line of work, usefulness trumped comfort every time. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, the outlaws took their positions. Each man carried enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, and they'd positioned caches of water and supplies at various points throughout the canyon. If things went according to plan, the ambush would be swift and decisive. If not, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the canyon like thunder, growing louder with each passing moment. 20 horses, just as Pike had predicted, their iron shoes striking sparks from the rocky trail. Blackwood peered through a gap in the rocks and saw them. A military convoy stretched out in a long line, the soldiers alert but not expecting immediate trouble. At the head of the column rode a man in a major's uniform, his bearing proud and confident despite the early hour. Major Harrison. A career soldier who'd survived some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War and earned a reputation for tactical brilliance. He was exactly the kind of opponent that Blackwood relished facing, intelligent, experienced, and dangerous. Behind Harrison rode his men, 12 cavalry troopers in dusty blue uniforms, their weapons ready but not yet drawn. The civilian scouts brought up the rear, a motley collection of frontier veterans and hired guns who looked capable of handling themselves in a fight. And in the middle of the column, heavily guarded and carefully positioned, was their prize, a packed train of 6 mules carrying strong boxes filled with $40,000 in gold bars. Enough wealth to set the outlaws up for life if they could take it and escape with their lives intact. The convoy entered the canyon, the horses' hooves clattering against stone as they navigated the narrow trail. Harrison raised his hand, signaling for the column to slow. He sensed something wrong, though he couldn't identify what. That moment of hesitation saved his life. Blackwood's rifle cracked like a whip, the bullet intended for Harrison's chest, instead taking the trooper beside him through the shoulder. The man screamed and toppled from his horse as chaos erupted throughout the canyon. "Ambush," Harrison shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Take cover." But there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose straight up on both sides, offering no shelter from the withering crossfire that erupted from the rocks above. Thornfield and Graves opened up from the north, their rifles spitting flame and death. Atlas and Ravenwood answered from the south, their heavier weapons booming like cannon fire. The cavalry horses reared and plunged in terror, throwing their riders or crushing them against the canyon walls. Men screamed and died, their blood splashing against the ancient stone like war paint. The pack mules bolted, scattering the gold-laden strongboxes across the rocky ground. But Harrison's men were veterans, and they didn't break easily. The major himself drew his saber and pistol, rallying his troops with parade ground precision. Form square, protect the gold. The surviving soldiers dismounted and took what cover they could find, returning fire with disciplined volleys that forced the outlaws to keep their heads down. The civilian scouts spread out, using their superior knowledge of frontier fighting to make every shot count. For 20 minutes, the battle raged with savage intensity. The canyon filled with smoke and the echoes of gunfire, the air thick with cordite and the copper smell of blood. Men died on both sides, their bodies sprawled across the trail like broken dolls. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. An eerie silence settled over Devil's Throat, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the nervous whickering of horses. Blackwood peered through the smoke, trying to assess the situation. Of the original 20-man convoy, perhaps 8 were still alive and fighting, but the outlaws had paid a price too. Ravenwood lay motionless on a ledge, his red beard dark with blood, and Atlas Stoneheart sat propped against a boulder, pressing a bloody cloth to a wound in his side. "Harrison," Blackwood called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. "You are outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender the gold and we will let you live." The Major's response was immediate and profane. "Go to hell, you murdering bastards." A rifle shot punctuated his defiance, the bullet whining off the rocks near Blackwood's head. The outlaw leader smiled grimly and settled in for a siege. Time was on their side. The soldiers' ammunition was limited, and the desert sun would soon turn the canyon into a furnace. But as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, strange things began to happen. Horses started dying for no apparent reason, simply collapsing as if their hearts had stopped. The wounded began to rave about voices calling to them from the canyon walls, speaking in languages that predated human memory. And through it all, Mordecai Ironwood remained absent, as if he'd simply ceased to exist. The sun hung directly overhead like a malevolent eye, turning the canyon into a natural oven. The surviving soldiers huddled in whatever shade they could find, their water running dangerously low. Several had already succumbed to heat stroke, their bodies adding to the growing collection of corpses scattered across the blood-stained trail. Blackwood wiped sweat from his forehead and checked his ammunition. They were running low too, and the situation was becoming untenable. What should have been a quick strike-and-grab operation had turned into a prolonged siege, and every hour that passed increased the likelihood of cavalry reinforcements arriving. "Zeph," Thornfield called out from his position on the north wall. "We need to end this. My water's gone, and Graves is starting to hallucinate." Indeed, Orion Graves was muttering to himself, his green eyes wide and unfocused as he stared at something only he could see. "The gold," he whispered. "It's singing to me, boys. Sweet as angels, promising us everything we ever wanted." Pike crawled over to their leader, his movements sluggish from heat exhaustion. "Something's wrong here, Zeph. This ain't natural. Look at the horses." Blackwood followed his gaze and felt a chill despite the brutal heat. The animals were dying one by one, their eyes rolling back in their heads as they collapsed without warning. No wounds, no obvious cause, they simply stopped living, as if some invisible force was draining the life from them. "The gold," Atlas Stoneheart rumbled from his makeshift shelter. "It's cursed, just like Ironwood said. We should have listened." "Shut up," Blackwood snapped, though his own confidence was wavering. He'd seen strange things in his years as an outlaw, but nothing like this. The very air seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy, and shadows moved in the corners of his vision when he wasn't looking directly at them. Below in the canyon, Major Harrison was having problems of his own. 3 more of his men had died in the past hour, not from bullet wounds but from some inexplicable wasting disease that aged them decades in minutes. Their hair turned white, their skin became parchment thin, and their eyes filled with the kind of terror that spoke of seeing unspeakable things. Harrison examined the nearest strongbox and immediately jerked his hand away. The metal was indeed burning hot, far too hot to be explained by the desert sun alone, and there was something else, a low, rhythmic sound that might have been chanting in a language that belonged to no human civilization. "Aztec gold," he murmured, remembering legends he'd heard from old-timers who'd served in the Mexican War. Blood gold, bathed in sacrifice and blessed by dark priests. The realization struck him like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting for their lives against a gang of outlaws. They were caught in something far older and more dangerous, something that had been waiting in the desert for centuries for the right moment to reclaim what was stolen from it. "We are leaving," he announced, his decision made. "Now, forget the gold. It's not worth our lives." But as he turned to signal the retreat, he found himself face to face with Mordecai Ironwood, who had appeared as silently as a shadow. The mysterious outlaw's pale eyes gleamed with an inner light, and his thin lips were curved in something that might have been a smile. "Too late," Ironwood whispered, his voice carrying despite its softness. "The compact is sealed. The price must be paid." "What compact?" Blackwood demanded, his hand moving to his pistol. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, Ironwood raised his arms toward the burning sky. The air around him began to shimmer and warp, as if reality itself was bending to his will. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and the shadows in the canyon began to move with purpose and intelligence. "Jesus Christ," Thornfield breathed from his position on the north wall. "He's one of them. He's been working with them all along." The them he referred to became clear as shapes began to emerge from the canyon walls. Tall, gaunt figures wrapped in tattered robes that might once have been white, but were now stained with centuries of blood and decay. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, but glowing eyes peered out from the darkness within. Below, Major Harrison and his surviving men watched in horror as more of the robed figures materialized around the scattered strongboxes. One of them knelt beside the nearest box and placed skeletal hands upon the hot metal. The whispering grew louder, becoming a chant that seemed to resonate in the very bones of everyone present. "The keepers of the gold have come to reclaim what was stolen," Ironwood intoned, his voice now carrying an otherworldly echo. "The compact made centuries ago must be fulfilled. 7 souls for 7 times 7 years of guardianship." Understanding dawned on Blackwood with sick certainty. They hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. They'd been manipulated, guided here by forces beyond their comprehension. The information about the gold shipment, the detailed maps, even their ability to stay ahead of the law for so long. It had all been orchestrated to bring them to this moment. "You bastard," he snarled, drawing his pistol and aiming it at Ironwood's heart. "You set us up." Ironwood's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. "I fulfilled my part of the bargain. The compact required 7 souls, freely given through their own greed and bloodlust. You came willingly, Zephyr Blackwood. You all did." The robed figures began to move with purpose, gliding across the canyon floor toward the trapped humans. Some approached the soldiers, while others made their way up the walls toward the outlaws' position. Their movements defied physics. They seemed to flow like water, unaffected by gravity or the normal limitations of physical form. "Fight them," Harrison shouted, raising his service pistol and firing point blank at the nearest figure. The bullet passed through the creature without effect, and skeletal fingers closed around his throat with impossible strength. All around the canyon, similar scenes played out as the ancient guardians claimed their due. Pistols and rifles proved useless against beings that existed somewhere between life and death, creatures bound to their eternal duty by forces older than civilization. Thornfield screamed as shadowy tendrils wrapped around his limbs, pulling him toward one of the robed figures. His Harvard education and refined manners meant nothing now. He was just another soul to be collected. Another payment on a debt that stretched back to the conquistadors who'd first stolen the gold from its rightful guardians. Pike tried to run, his knowledge of the desert useless against enemies that could move through solid rock. He made it perhaps 50 yards before the shadows caught him, dragging him back toward the canyon within human strength. One by one, the outlaws and soldiers alike were claimed by the ancient guardians. Some fought to the end. Others begged for mercy that would never come. The creatures showed no emotion, no malice. They were simply fulfilling their function, collecting what was owed according to laws that predated human memory. Atlas Stoneheart put up the fiercest resistance, his massive frame and incredible strength allowing him to actually grapple with one of the creatures. For a moment it seemed he might break free, his powerful hands tearing at the tattered robes. But then more of them surrounded him, and even his superhuman strength wasn't enough. As the big man disappeared beneath a writhing mass of shadow and bone, his final words echoed through the canyon, "Atlas dies." In the end, only Blackwood remained, backed against the canyon wall with his smoking pistol in one hand and his knife in the other. Around him, the robed figures waited with infinite patience, their glowing eyes fixed upon him with ancient hunger. "The compact is nearly complete," Ironwood said, his human disguise beginning to slip away like smoke. Beneath it was something far older and more terrible, a being of shadow and starlight, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "One soul remains to seal the bargain." "Go to hell," Blackwood spat, raising his pistol for one final futile shot. But before he could pull the trigger, the world exploded into darkness and screaming wind. The last thing he saw was Ironwood's true face revealed in all its terrible glory. Not human at all, but something that had worn human form like a mask, something that served powers beyond mortal comprehension. Then the darkness claimed him, and Zephyr Blackwood, leader of the most feared outlaw gang in the territories, ceased to exist. Silence settled over the canyon like a burial shroud. The bodies of men and horses were gone, vanished without a trace as if they'd never existed at all. Even the blood had been scrubbed from the rocks, leaving no evidence of the battle that had raged there. The strong boxes remained, but they were no longer hot to the touch. The gold inside had returned to its dormant state, waiting for the next group of fools greedy enough to try to claim it. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, a new sound echoed through the desert air, the distant thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the east. A cavalry patrol sent to investigate when Major Harrison's column failed to reach its destination. They would find nothing but empty desert and a few scattered horseshoes. The mystery of the vanished convoy would baffle investigators for decades, spawning legends and ghost stories that would outlive everyone involved. But deep in the whispering caves, where shadows danced to music only the dead could hear, 7 new guardians took their places among the ranks of the ancient watchers. Their human memories faded like smoke, replaced by an eternal purpose that would bind them to the gold until the end of time. And somewhere in the darkness, Mordecai Ironwood smiled his terrible smile and began planning for the next group of souls, foolish enough to seek the cursed treasure of the Aztec kings. The desert keeps its secrets, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. 3 years had passed since the desert swallowed 7 of the most dangerous men in the territories, and the legend of Zephyr Blackwood's gang had begun to fade into frontier folklore. New outlaws had risen to take their place, new crimes demanded attention, and the world had moved on as it always did. But the desert remembers everything, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Hawthorne stood at the window of the Tucson jail, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 42, Hawthorne was a man carved from desert stone, lean, hard, and marked by 2 decades of chasing killers across the most unforgiving landscape in North America. His gray eyes had seen too much death. His scarred hands had drawn his gun in anger more times than he cared to count, and his soul carried the weight of every man he'd been forced to kill in the name of justice. The telegram in his shirt pocket had arrived 3 days ago, carried by a rider who'd pushed his horse to the point of collapse to deliver it. The message was brief but disturbing. 7 horses and saddles found near Whispering Caves. Stop brands, match Blackwood gang. Stop require investigation. Stop Marshal Davidson. Now, as Hawthorne prepared to ride out into the desert wastes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something that should have remained hidden. The Blackwood gang had simply vanished 3 years ago, disappeared as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. No bodies, no trace, no clues. Just 7 of the most notorious criminals in the territories gone without explanation. Marshal? Hawthorne turned to see his deputy, a young man named Timothy Ashworth, standing in the doorway with obvious nervousness written across his boyish features. At 24, Ashworth was everything Hawthorne had once been: eager, idealistic, and still believing that good always triumphed over evil in the end. The desert hadn't beaten that optimism out of him yet, but Hawthorne knew it would given time. "The horses are ready," Ashworth continued, his voice barely concealing his excitement. "Doc Meridian is loading his equipment, and Miss Blackwood insists she's coming with us." Hawthorne sighed and set down his coffee cup. Martha Blackwood, the widow who'd been tracking the gang when they disappeared, had been petitioning for weeks to join the investigation. She claimed a right to know what had happened to the men who'd killed her husband, and Hawthorne found it difficult to argue with her logic. She was also one of the few people alive who could positively identify the gang's equipment. "And Dr. Meridian?" Hawthorne asked. "Ready to go, though he keeps muttering about unnatural phenomena and checking his thermometers." Dr. Cornelius Meridian was Tucson's physician, but his true passion lay in what he called scientific investigation of unexplained events. The man had studied at Harvard Medical School before coming west to pursue his theories about supernatural occurrences. Most people considered him eccentric at best, but Hawthorne had learned to respect the doctor's analytical mind and his ability to find rational explanations for seemingly impossible events. 20 minutes later, the 4-person expedition rode out of Tucson toward the Whispering Caves, their pack horses loaded with supplies for a week in the desert. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and creosote, but as they traveled deeper into the wasteland, an oppressive atmosphere seemed to settle over the group like a physical weight. Martha Blackwood rode beside Hawthorne, her black mourning dress practical but elegant, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. At 31, she was still a beautiful woman, but grief and the desire for vengeance had carved hard lines around her eyes and mouth. She'd spent 3 years learning to track, to shoot, to survive in the desert, all in service of her obsession with finding the men who'd destroyed her life. "Tell me about that day," Hawthorne said as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of broken ground. "The day they disappeared." Martha's jaw tightened, but she answered in a steady voice. "I'd been following them for weeks, staying far enough back to avoid detection. They were planning something big. I could tell from the way they moved, the supplies they gathered. When they rode out of Tombstone that morning, I followed at a distance." "How far did you track them?" "To the edge of Devil's Throat Canyon. I waited on a ridge about 2 miles away, watching through field glasses. I saw them take positions for an ambush, saw the cavalry convoy enter the canyon." She paused, her knuckles white as she gripped her horse's reins. "Then the shooting started." Dr. Meridian, riding slightly behind them, leaned forward with interest. His pale, scholarly features were already showing the effects of desert exposure, despite the wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. "What did you observe during the battle?" "Gunfire for about 20 minutes, then silence. I waited until dark, then crept closer to investigate." Martha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The canyon was empty. No bodies, no blood, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Even the brass cartridge cases were gone. Deputy Ashworth guided his horse around a cluster of barrel cacti, his young face creased with concentration. "Maybe they buried the evidence. Outlaws don't usually leave calling cards." 27 men don't just vanish," Martha replied sharply. "I counted them myself, 7 outlaws, 20 in the convoy. They couldn't all have simply disappeared." But Hawthorne knew the desert well enough to understand that impossible things happened with disturbing regularity in this harsh land. He'd seen mirages that seemed more real than reality, heard voices calling from empty canyons, witnessed phenomena that defied rational explanation. The Sonoran Desert was a place where the line between natural and supernatural became dangerously thin. The landscape around the Whispering Caves was unlike anywhere else in the territory. Instead of the usual red sandstone and desert scrub, the ground here was black volcanic rock, twisted into impossible shapes by ancient geological forces. Steam vents hissed from cracks in the earth, and the air shimmered with heat that seemed to come from below rather than from the sun above. There, Martha pointed toward a depression in the volcanic field. That's where Marshal Davidson's men found the horses. The discovery site was a natural corral formed by walls of black stone, hidden from casual observation but easily defensible. As the investigation team approached, they could see the equipment laid out in neat rows: 7 saddles, 7 sets of bridles and tack, arranged with military precision despite 3 years of exposure to desert weather. Dr. Meridian dismounted first, pulling a leather satchel full of scientific instruments from his pack horse. "Remarkable," he murmured, kneeling beside the nearest saddle. "The preservation is extraordinary. Leather goods exposed to desert conditions for 3 years should show significant deterioration, but these appear almost new." Hawthorne examined the gear more closely, noting details that made his skin crawl. The leather was indeed in perfect condition, supple and oiled as if it had been maintained daily. But more disturbing were the personal items still attached to each saddle knife sheaths, ammunition pouches, even a few silver coins in one of the saddlebags. "Nobody abandons this kind of equipment," he said grimly. "These saddles cost more than most men make in a year. And the personal effects." He held up a silver pocket watch, engraved with the initials CT. "Caspian Thornfield. I'd bet my badge on it." Deputy Ashworth had been examining the brands on the saddles, comparing them to descriptions in wanted posters. "This one belongs to Orion Graves. See the distinctive tooling on the stirrup leathers. And this massive saddle could only belong to Atlas Stoneheart." But it was Martha who made the most disturbing discovery. Kneeling beside the smallest saddle in the collection, she held up a bone-handled knife that gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Lysander Pike," she whispered. "I watched him clean his fingernails with this knife every morning in Tombstone." Dr. Meridian had set up his equipment and was taking temperature readings throughout the site. His thermometers showed consistent readings 20 degrees below what they should have been, given the ambient air temperature and direct sunlight. "Fascinating," he muttered, making notes in a leather-bound journal. "The thermal anomalies suggest some form of geothermal activity, but the pattern is highly unusual." As the afternoon wore on, more disturbing details emerged. The horses' hoofprints were still visible in the volcanic sand, as clear and sharp as if they'd been made yesterday. But the prints told a story that made no sense. The animals had arrived at the site from different directions, at different times, and appeared to have been moving without riders. "Look at this," Ashworth called out from the eastern edge of the site. He was kneeling beside a series of tracks that seemed to glow faintly in the shadow of a rock formation. "These prints, they are not quite right." Hawthorne examined the tracks and felt his blood turn to ice water. They were horse tracks, but subtly wrong in ways that defied description. The proportions were off, the depth inconsistent, and there was something about the shape that suggested the creatures that made them weren't entirely natural. Martha had found something else, a series of symbols carved into the volcanic rock, hidden beneath centuries of mineral deposits. As she brushed away the accumulated grime, the markings became visible, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the failing light, geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. "Aztec," Dr. Meridian said with certainty after examining the symbols. "But not classical Aztec. These are older, from a civilization that predates the empire by centuries. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." "What do they mean?" Martha asked. The doctor's face had gone pale beneath his desert tan. "They are binding symbols, used in ancient rituals to trap souls and prevent them from moving on to whatever comes after death." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group as the implications sank in. The discovery of the gang's equipment was mysterious enough, but the presence of ancient binding symbols suggested something far more sinister than a simple case of missing persons. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, Hawthorne made the decision to make camp at the site. They'd brought enough supplies for several days, and he wanted to conduct a thorough investigation before returning to Tucson. But as they set up their bedrolls and prepared a simple meal over a small fire, all 4 members of the group found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, as if expecting to see something watching them from the shadows. The desert night brought its own collection of sounds: the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals moving through the scrub, the whisper of wind through the volcanic formation. But tonight, there were other sounds mixed in with the natural chorus. Voices speaking in languages that belonged to no living civilization. The echo of footsteps where no one walked. And beneath it all, the rhythmic chanting that gave the whispering caves their name. Dr. Meridian sat by the dying fire, frantically scribbling notes in his journal by lamplight. His scientific instruments had been recording anomalous readings all evening: electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature variations, and atmospheric pressure changes that followed no known pattern. The phenomena intensifying, he reported to Hawthorne, who was standing guard at the edge of their camp. Whatever force is at work here, it becomes more active after dark. Martha Blackwood lay in her bedroll, staring up at stars that seemed dimmer than they should have been. The darkness above was not the clean black of a normal desert night, but something deeper and more oppressive, as if the very light was being absorbed by some invisible presence. Marshal Deputy Ashworth's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "I think you should see this." Hawthorne followed the young man to the eastern edge of the camp, where the collection of saddles and tack had been arranged earlier. In the moonlight, something impossible was happening. The leather goods were moving, shifting position with slow, deliberate purpose. As they watched in horrified fascination, the 7 saddles arranged themselves in a perfect circle, the stirrups and reins writhing like living things. The silver coins and personal effects rose from the saddlebags, floating in the air and spinning in complex patterns that seemed to follow some arcane geometry. "Jesus Christ," Ashworth whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the cross he wore around his neck. But the supernatural display was just beginning. From the darkness beyond their camp came the sound of hoofbeats, 7 horses approaching at a steady walk. The sound grew louder and more distinct, but no animals appeared in the firelight. The hoofbeats circled the camp 3 times, then stopped directly behind the arranged saddles. Dr. Meridian had abandoned his scientific instruments and was now watching the spectacle with the fascination of a man witnessing history in the making. "Remarkable," he breathed. "We are observing some form of psychic imprint, emotional energy so intense that it's left a permanent mark on the physical world." "Shut up, Doc," Hawthorne growled, his rifle ready in his hands. "Whatever this is, it's not natural." The temperature around the camp began to drop rapidly, their breath forming visible clouds in air that had been sweltering just hours before. Frost began to form on the volcanic rock, despite the fact that desert frost was impossible at this time of year. Then the voices started. At first, they were barely audible, whispers in the wind that might have been imagination. But gradually they became clearer, more distinct, until the 4 investigators could make out individual words and phrases. "The gold, it calls to us, forever bound, forever watching. 7 souls for 7 times 7 years. Martha bolted upright in her bedroll, her face white with terror. "I know those voices," she gasped. "Blackwood and his gang. They are here." As if summoned by her recognition, 7 figures began to materialize in the space between the floating saddles. They appeared slowly, like images developing on photographic plates, translucent at first, then gaining substance and definition until they seemed almost solid. Zephyr Blackwood stood at the center of the circle, his pale eyes now burning with an inner fire that had nothing to do with human emotion. His black hair flowed in a wind that no one else could feel, and his scarred face bore an expression of eternal torment mixed with grim purpose. Around him stood his 6 companions, each bearing the marks of whatever transformation had claimed them. Caspian Thornfield's refined features were now sharp as knife blades, his Harvard education replaced by knowledge far older and more terrible. Orion Graves's green eyes glowed like emeralds in the darkness, and his auburn hair seemed to move with a life of its own. Atlas Stoneheart's massive frame towered over the others, but his dark skin now had a grayish pallor that spoke of death and resurrection. Lysander Pike's thin form had become even more gaunt, his movements precise and predatory as a hunting spider. Galileo Ravenwood's red beard flickered like flame, and his blue eyes reflected depths that no living man should see. But it was the 7th figure that commanded the most attention. Mordecai Ironwood stood apart from the others, his black hat still shadowing his face, but his pale skin now seemed to emit its own faint luminescence. He was no longer pretending to be human. Whatever he truly was had been revealed in all its terrible glory. "You shouldn't have come here," Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the camp, though his lips barely moved. "This place is not for the living." Hawthorne raised his rifle, though he knew bullets would be useless against whatever these things had become. "What happened, Hugh? Where have you been for 3 years?" Blackwood's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. "Time has no meaning here. We guard the gold as our predecessors guarded it, as their predecessors guarded it before them. The compact binds us to this purpose until the stars grow cold." Dr. Meridian stepped forward, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear. "The gold, it's cursed, isn't it? Aztec gold taken from sacred temples. Blood gold." Ironwood spoke for the first time, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the listener's bones. "Blessed by dark priests and bathed in the blood of sacrifices, it remembers its origin, and it demands guardians to protect it from those who would steal it again." Martha found her voice at last, standing to face the spectral outlaws with all the courage she could muster. "You killed my husband. You destroyed my life. I have a right to know why." Orion Graves turned his glowing eyes toward her, and for a moment, something almost human flickered in their depths. "Your husband was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We needed money for supplies, weapons, horses. His death was incidental." "Incidental?" Martha's voice rose to a near scream. "He was everything to me, and now we are nothing." Atlas Stoneheart rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "Bound to this desert, slaves to powers we cannot comprehend. Is that justice enough for you, woman?" The spectral figures began to fade, their forms becoming translucent once more. But before they disappeared entirely, Blackwood raised one ghostly hand in warning. "Leave this place," he commanded. "Take our saddles, our possessions, our memory back to the world of the living. But do not seek the gold. Do not try to follow us into the darkness. Some prices are too high to pay, even for justice." "Wait," Dr. Meridian called out. "The binding symbols, how do we break them? How do we set you free?" But the outlaws were already gone, vanished like smoke on the desert wind. Only their saddles remained, arranged in their perfect circle, cold to the touch and somehow heavier than they should have been. Dawn came slowly to the volcanic landscape, the sun's rays struggling to penetrate a morning mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The 4 investigators huddled around the rekindled fire, drinking coffee and trying to process what they'd witnessed during the night. Dr. Meridian had filled 3 notebooks with observations and theories, his scientific mind working overtime to find rational explanations for impossible events. The thermal readings, the electromagnetic anomalies, the acoustic phenomena, it all points to some form of dimensional interface, a place where the barriers between worlds have worn thin. "You mean it's haunted?" Ashworth said bluntly. "I mean it's a nexus point where the laws of physics operate differently than in the normal world. The ancient civilizations understood this. That's why they chose this location for their rituals." Martha had been silent since the encounter, staring into the flames with haunted eyes. Finally, she looked up at Hawthorne. They are suffering. Whatever they have become, they are trapped here, forced to guard something they never wanted. Maybe, Hawthorne acknowledged, but they are also dangerous. Did you see the way they moved? The way their eyes glowed? They are not human anymore, Martha. They are something else entirely. As they prepared to break camp and return to Tucson, more disturbing evidence came to light. Deputy Ashworth found footprints around their campsite, human prints that glowed faintly in the shadows, as if the feet that made them generated their own light. The prints formed complex patterns that seemed to have ritual significance, though none of them could interpret their meaning. Dr. Meridian made one final discovery that chilled them all to the bone. While packing his instruments, he noticed that his photographic plates had been exposed during the night, despite being stored in light-tight containers. When developed later, they would show images of the 7 spectral outlaws standing around the investigators' camp, watching them sleep with expressions of infinite sadness and terrible purpose. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when they loaded the outlaws' equipment onto their pack horses. The saddles, bridles, and personal effects had changed somehow during the night. They were now burning cold to the touch, so frigid that they had to be handled with thick gloves to prevent frostbite. It's like they have been stored in ice for 3 years, Ashworth observed, his breath forming clouds as he secured the last of the equipment. Not ice, Dr. Meridian corrected grimly. Something far colder than ice, something that exists in the spaces between worlds. As they rode away from the Whispering Caves, none of them looked back, but they all felt the weight of invisible eyes watching their departure, and the sound of ghostly hoofbeats seemed to echo in their ears long after the volcanic landscape had disappeared behind them. Marshal Davidson was a practical man who'd spent 30 years in law enforcement, but the report that Hawthorne submitted tested the limits of his credibility. The physical evidence was undeniable. 7 sets of perfectly preserved outlaw equipment, photographic plates showing impossible images, and scientific readings that defied explanation. "So you are telling me," Davidson said slowly, leaning back in his chair, "that Zephyr Blackwood and his gang are ghosts, bound to guard cursed Aztec gold somewhere in the desert?" "I'm telling you what we observed," Hawthorne replied carefully. "Make your own interpretations." Martha Blackwood sat in the corner of the office, still dressed in her black mourning clothes, but somehow changed by her experience at the Whispering Caves. The desperate hunger for vengeance that had driven her for 3 years had been replaced by something else, a profound sadness mixed with unwilling compassion. "They are trapped," she said quietly. "Whatever they were in life, they are prisoners now, forced to serve powers they can't understand or control." Dr. Meridian spread his photographs across Davidson's desk, each one showing clear images of the spectral outlaws. "The evidence is conclusive. We witnessed a genuine supernatural phenomenon, the spirits of the dead, bound to a specific location by forces that predate European settlement by centuries." Davidson studied the photographs with the skepticism of a career lawman, but he couldn't deny what his eyes were seeing. "Even if I accept all this, and I'm not saying I do, what am I supposed to do about it? You can't arrest ghosts and you can't prosecute the dead." "You can close the case," Hawthorne suggested. "Mark it solved but sealed. The Blackwood gang is accounted for. They are not going to commit any more crimes in our jurisdiction." But even as he said it, Hawthorne knew the situation was far from resolved. The outlaws might be trapped at the Whispering Caves, but the gold they guarded was still out there somewhere, still calling to anyone greedy or desperate enough to seek it. And as long as the treasure remained hidden in the desert, more people would come looking for it. Some would be treasure hunters, drawn by legends of lost Spanish gold. Others would be archaeologists, seeking to unlock the secrets of ancient civilizations. Still others would be outlaws like the original 7, men desperate enough to risk their souls for wealth beyond imagining. And all of them would face the same choice that had confronted Blackwood's gang 3 years ago: turn back while they still could, or proceed into the darkness and join the eternal guardians of the blood gold. Martha stood on the porch of her small ranch house, watching the sun set over the desert that had claimed her husband's killers. 3 years of planning, tracking, and dreaming of revenge had ended not with justice, but with a terrible understanding of the price that vengeance could exact. In her hands, she held the only personal item she'd kept from the recovered equipment, Zephyr Blackwood's silver pocket watch. It had stopped running at exactly 3:17 p.m. on October 14, 1867, the moment when the gang leader's mortal life had ended and his eternal imprisonment had begun. As darkness fell across the desert, Martha thought she could hear something in the wind, voices calling from the direction of the whispering caves, speaking words in languages that belonged to no living civilization. The sound was faint, almost inaudible, but it carried a message that she understood without translation. The gold remembers. The gold waits. The gold calls. She closed the watch and slipped it into her pocket, making a silent promise to the 7 damned souls trapped in the volcanic wasteland. Their story would be told, their fate would be remembered, and their warning would be heeded by anyone wise enough to listen. But Martha also knew that warnings were rarely heeded when gold was involved. Greed was a powerful force, stronger than fear, stronger than caution, stronger than the tales of dead men walking the desert night. Others would come, drawn by legends and rumors, seeking the treasure that had claimed 7 of the most dangerous men in the territories. And when they did, the Guardians would be waiting. The Copper King saloon reeked of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and desperation, the perfect breeding ground for the kind of legends that drew desperate men to their doom. In a corner booth shrouded in tobacco smoke, 5 men huddled around a hand-drawn map, their voices low and urgent as they planned what they believed would be the greatest treasure hunt in frontier history. Maximilian Cordwainer sat at the head of the table, his manicured fingers tracing routes across the crude cartography. At 38, Cordwainer was what passed for an Eastern gentleman in the territories, expensively dressed, well-educated, and completely ignorant of the harsh realities of desert survival. He'd made his fortune in railroad speculation back in Boston, but a series of bad investments and a scandal involving a senator's daughter had driven him west in search of a new start. Gentlemen. Cordwainer's cultured voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never truly failed at anything important. We stand on the threshold of history, 40,000 in Aztec gold, guarded only by superstition and the bones of 7 long-dead outlaws. Across from him, Tobias Grimwald spat into a brass spittoon and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. At 45, Grimwald was everything Cordwainer was not. A hard man forged by 20 years of mining camps, Indian wars, and the kind of violence that left permanent scars on both body and soul. His left eye was milky white from a knife fight in Deadwood, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who dug his living from unforgiving rock. Dead men don't guard nothing, Grimwald growled, his voice roughened by years of shouting over mining equipment. I have seen plenty of ghosts in my time, usually at the bottom of a bottle. Gold is gold, and I intend to have my share. The third member of their group remained silent, methodically cleaning a rifle that gleamed like liquid mercury in the lamplight. Valentino Salvatore had arrived in Phoenix 3 weeks ago, claiming to be an Italian nobleman seeking adventure in the American frontier. But his pale eyes held the kind of cold calculation that spoke of assassination rather than adventure, and the weapons he carried were crafted with European precision. The reports are consistent, Salvatore said finally, his accent carrying traces of Milan and Rome. 7 sets of equipment discovered perfectly preserved after 3 years in the desert. Witnesses describing supernatural encounters. Either we are dealing with an elaborate hoax or something genuinely extraordinary. Beside him, Nathaniel Crowbear nodded grimly. Half Apache, half Irish, Crowbear served as their guide and tracker, though his motives for joining the expedition remained mysterious. At 32, he'd spent his life caught between 2 worlds, never fully accepted by either the Apache or the white settlers. His dark eyes held depths of knowledge that made the others uncomfortable, and he spoke of the whispering caves with a reverence that bordered on fear. My grandmother's people knew of that place, he said quietly. They called it Sanarjini Bikia, the place where spirits walk. Even the fiercest warriors would not approach it after sunset. The fifth member of their group laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a funeral parlor. Sebastian Nightshade was perhaps 25 years old, though his prematurely white hair and the lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived through experiences that aged a man beyond his years. He claimed to be a student of the occult, a collector of supernatural artifacts and forbidden knowledge. Primitive superstitions, Nightshade said dismissively, though his fingers unconsciously traced protective symbols on the silver amulets hanging around his neck. The indigenous peoples lacked the scientific framework to understand psychic phenomena. What they interpret as spirits are merely electromagnetic disturbances caused by unusual mineral deposits. Cordwainer consulted his pocket watch, a gold timepiece that had cost more than most men earned in a year. We ride at dawn. 3 days hard travel should put us at the Whispering Caves, where we will conduct a systematic search for the treasure. With proper equipment and rational thinking, we will succeed where superstition and cowardice have failed others. But even as he spoke, Cordwainer couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching their every move. Outside, wind had picked up, rattling the saloon's windows and carrying sounds that seemed almost like whispers in the darkness. 3 days of hard riding had brought the treasure hunters to the edge of the volcanic wasteland that surrounded the Whispering Caves. The landscape here defied description. Black rock twisted into impossible shapes, steam vents that hissed like serpents, and an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. Crowbear had grown increasingly agitated as they approached their destination, muttering prayers in Apache and making protective gestures whenever he thought the others weren't watching. Now, as they made camp in the pre-dawn darkness, he approached Cordwainer with obvious reluctance. "We should turn back," the half-breed said quietly. "This place, it's not meant for the living. The spirits here are angry, hungry. They have been waiting a long time for new souls to claim." Cordwainer laughed and clapped the guide on the shoulder. "My dear fellow, you are letting primitive fears cloud your judgment. We are educated men of the 19th century, not superstitious savages cowering before natural phenomena we don't understand." But his confident words rang hollow in the unnatural silence that surrounded them. The usual desert sounds, coyotes, owls, the rustle of small animals were completely absent. Even their horses seemed nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting attack from some invisible predator. Grimwald had been examining the ground around their campsite, and his findings were disturbing. "Tracks," he announced grimly. "Human tracks, but wrong somehow. Too deep in some places, too shallow in others, and they glow faintly in the shadows." Salvatore loaded his rifle with practiced efficiency, his pale eyes scanning the darkness for threats. "How many sets of tracks?" "7, Grimwald replied, though he seemed reluctant to say the number aloud, all leading toward the caves. Nightshade had set up various instruments around their camp, crystals, metal rods, and devices of his own design that he claimed could detect supernatural activity. Now the equipment was registering readings that made him visibly nervous. "The psychic energy levels are extraordinary," he reported, consulting a series of gauges and meters. "Whatever happened here, it left a permanent imprint on the fabric of reality itself." As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of another scorching desert day, the treasure hunters prepared to enter the Whispering Caves. Each man checked his weapons, reviewed his equipment, and tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the volcanic landscape ahead. But they were not the only ones stirring in the pre-dawn darkness. Deep within the caves, 7 figures stood in eternal vigil, their spectral forms gaining substance as living souls approached their domain. The guardians of the blood gold had felt the treasure hunters coming for days, drawn by the familiar mixture of greed and desperation that had brought so many before them. Zephyr Blackwood raised his ghostly head, pale eyes burning with otherworldly fire. "They come," he whispered to his companions. 5 more souls to feed the hunger of the gold. The entrance to the whispering caves yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its depths hidden in shadows that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. The treasure hunters stood at the threshold, their confidence from the previous night now severely tested by the reality of what they faced. The caves were a natural formation carved from volcanic rock by centuries of wind and water, but there was something artificial about their construction, as if human hands had modified and expanded the original caverns for purposes that defied imagination. Strange symbols were carved into the rock walls, similar to those Martha Blackwood's expedition had discovered 5 years earlier, but these were deeper, older, somehow more alive. The air temperature inside is at least 20 degrees cooler than outside, Nightshade observed, consulting his instruments. And the electromagnetic readings, they are off the charts. Cordwainer lit a lantern and stepped through the entrance, his expensive boots echoing strangely in the confined space. Gentlemen, we didn't come this far to be deterred by atmospheric anomalies. The gold is in here somewhere, and we are going to find it. The caves extended much deeper than any of them had anticipated, branching and dividing into a maze of tunnels that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in their peripheral vision. The carved symbols appeared to shift and writhe in the flickering light, and the temperature continued to drop as they ventured deeper underground. Crowbear had been silent since entering the caves, but now he stopped abruptly and held up his hand for the others to halt. "Listen," he whispered. At first, they heard nothing but the echo of their own breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. But gradually, other sounds became audible, voices speaking in languages that belonged to no living civilization, the scrape of footsteps on stone floors, and beneath it all, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to resonate in their very bones. "The Whispers," Grimwald said hoarsely. "That's why they call this place the Whispering Caves." Salvatore had drawn his rifle and was scanning the shadows for targets. It could be an acoustic phenomenon, sound traveling through the rock formations in unusual ways. But even as he spoke, the Italian nobleman's voice lacked conviction. There was something about the whispers that transcended mere acoustic effects. They seemed to be speaking directly into the listeners' minds, bypassing the ears entirely. After an hour of careful exploration, they discovered a large chamber deep within the cave system. The room was perfectly circular, carved from solid rock with precision that spoke of advanced engineering. In the center of the chamber sat 7 stone pedestals, each one bearing symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. "This is it," Cordwainer breathed, his voice filled with awe and avarice. "The treasure chamber." But the room was empty, no gold, no artifacts, nothing but the strange pedestals and the ever-present whispers that seemed to grow louder in the confined space. As they examined the chamber more closely, however, disturbing details emerged. The floor was stained with what looked like centuries-old bloodstains, arranged in complex patterns that suggested ritual sacrifice. The walls bore more of the carved symbols, but these were different from the others. They seemed to move and shift when viewed directly, causing headaches and nausea in anyone who stared at them too long. "Where's the gold?" Grimwald demanded, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The reports said 40,000 in Aztec treasure. There's nothing here but rocks and old blood." Nightshade had set up his instruments around the chamber and was taking readings that made his face progressively paler. "The psychic energy is incredible," he reported. "This room is the focal point of whatever forces are at work here. But the gold, it's not physically present." "What do you mean?" Cordwainer snapped, his genteel facade beginning to crack under the strain of disappointment and growing fear. "I mean the treasure exists in a state of quantum flux," Nightshade explained, his voice taking on the manic edge of a man whose scientific worldview was being systematically destroyed. "It phases in and out of our reality, appearing only when certain conditions are met." As if summoned by his words, The temperature in the chamber began to drop rapidly. Their breath formed visible clouds in air that had been sweltering just moments before, and frost began to form on the stone walls despite the desert heat above. Then the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the voices had been, a pregnant quiet that seemed to press against their eardrums like a physical force. In that moment of absolute stillness, 7 figures began to materialize in the spaces between the stone pedestals. The spectral outlaws appeared slowly, their forms gaining substance and definition, until they seemed almost solid. But there was nothing human left in their appearance. They had become something else entirely during their years of guardianship, shaped by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Zephyr Blackwood stood directly in front of Cordwainer, his pale eyes burning with otherworldly fire. The outlaw leader's black hair flowed in a wind that no one else could feel, and his scarred face bore an expression of infinite sadness mixed with grim purpose. "You seek the gold," Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the chamber, though his lips barely moved. "All who come here seek the gold, but the price of possession is higher than any mortal can pay." Salvatore raised his rifle and fired point-blank at the apparition, but the bullet passed through Blackwood's form without effect. The Italian nobleman's face went white as he realized that conventional weapons were useless against whatever these things had become. Caspian Thornfield materialized beside his leader, his refined features now sharp as knife blades. "We tried to warn the others," he said, his Harvard accent somehow making the words even more chilling. "The deputy marshal and his companions 5 years ago, we told them to leave, to forget what they had seen. But men never listen to such warnings when gold is involved." Atlas Stoneheart's massive form loomed over Grimwald, the spectral giant's dark eyes holding depths of knowledge that no living man should possess. "You want to see the treasure?" His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Very well, but know that to look upon the blood gold is to be forever changed." The 7 pedestals began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. As the treasure hunters watched in horrified fascination, objects began to materialize on each platform. Golden artifacts of incredible beauty and obvious antiquity, ceremonial masks, jeweled daggers, and coins bearing symbols that predated European contact by centuries. But there was something wrong with the gold. It seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and the metal appeared to be wet, not with water or condensation, but with something dark and viscous that looked disturbingly like fresh blood. "Aztec treasure," Orion Graves explained, his green eyes glowing like emeralds in the supernatural light. "Taken from the temples of Tenochtitlan, blessed by priests who served gods older than memory. Each piece was consecrated with human sacrifice, bathed in the blood of innocence to give it power beyond mere wealth." Cordwainer stepped toward the nearest pedestal, his greed overcoming his fear. "It's real," he whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers. "It's all real." "Don't touch it," Crowbear shouted, but his warning came too late. The moment Cordwainer's fingers made contact with the golden mask, his scream echoed through the chamber like the cry of a damned soul. The treasure hunter's body convulsed as invisible fire raced through his veins, aging him decades in seconds. His perfectly groomed hair turned white, his smooth skin became parchment thin, and his eyes filled with the kind of terror that spoke of seeing unspeakable things. When the convulsion stopped, Cordwainer was still alive, but he was no longer entirely human. His form had become translucent, caught somewhere between life and death, just like the 7 outlaws who watched him with expressions of terrible sympathy. "The compact is sealed," Mordecai Ironwood spoke for the first time, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical world. "Another soul joins the Eternal Guardians." Grimwald tried to run, but spectral hands reached out from the shadows to drag him back toward the glowing pedestals. His curses and pleas echoed through the chamber as Lysander Pike's gaunt form materialized beside him, the phantom outlaw's bone-handled knife gleaming in the supernatural light. "There is no escape," Pike whispered, his voice soft and sibilant as a serpent's hiss. "The blood gold calls, and the gold must be obeyed. 7 guardians for 7 times 7 years. That was the original compact. But the curse has grown stronger with each passing decade, and now it requires more." One by one, the remaining treasure hunters were claimed by the supernatural forces that guarded the Aztec gold. Salvatore's rifle proved useless against enemies that existed between worlds, and his aristocratic composure crumbled as spectral hands dragged him toward his fate. Nightshade's occult knowledge served only to make him more aware of the hopelessness of his situation, and his screams of theoretical understanding were drowned out by the chanting that had resumed with renewed intensity. Crowbear lasted the longest, his Apache heritage giving him some protection against the supernatural forces at work. But even his grandmother's medicine could not shield him from powers that predated his people's arrival in the desert. As Galileo Ravenwood's spectral form embraced him with arms like frozen flame, the half-breed guide whispered a final prayer in the language of his ancestors. When the last echo faded, 12 figures stood in the circular chamber, the original 7 outlaws now joined by 5 new guardians. The golden artifacts pulsed with renewed life, fed by the spiritual energy of their latest victims. The curse had grown stronger, more demanding, hungrier for the souls of those who would dare to steal what belonged to gods older than memory. Martha Blackwood sat in the telegraph office, her fingers trembling as she composed another warning message. 8 days had passed since the treasure hunters had ridden out of Phoenix, and she knew with sick certainty that they would never return. The same pattern had repeated itself 3 times in the past 5 years. Greedy men drawn by legends of Aztec gold, vanishing without a trace into the volcanic wasteland that surrounded the Whispering Caves. To all territorial authorities, stop Cordwainer. Expedition missing. Stop presumed dead. Stop advise extreme caution regarding Whispering Caves. Stop Martha Blackwood. The telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Peterson, looked up from his key with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, this is the 4th such message you have sent this year. Maybe it's time to accept that some folks just don't listen to warning." Martha stood and smoothed her black dress. She'd never stopped wearing mourning clothes, though now she grieved for more than just her murdered husband. "Keep sending the messages, Mr. Peterson. Someone has to try to warn them." As she walked through the dusty streets of Phoenix, Martha reflected on the irony of her situation. She'd spent 3 years hunting the men who killed her husband, dreaming of the moment when justice would finally be served. But when that moment came, she'd found herself feeling pity rather than satisfaction. The 7 outlaws had become victims themselves, trapped by forces beyond their understanding or control. Now she tried to prevent others from sharing their fate, but her warnings fell on deaf ears. Men blinded by greed refused to believe in supernatural guardians or cursed gold. They saw only the promise of wealth beyond measure, and they rode out into the desert to claim their prize. And none of them ever came back. In the circular chamber deep beneath the volcanic rock, 12 spectral figures stood in eternal vigil around the pedestals of blood gold. The newest guardians, Cordwainer and his companions, were still adapting to their transformed existence, their faces bearing expressions of shock and despair as the reality of their situation became clear. "How long?" Cordwainer asked, his cultured voice now carrying the same otherworldly echoes as his predecessors. "How long must we remain here?" Zephyr Blackwood turned his burning eyes toward the newcomer, and for a moment, something almost resembling compassion flickered in their depths. "Time has no meaning in this place. We have been here 8 years by mortal reckoning, but it feels like centuries. The curse binds us to this purpose until what?" Salvatore demanded, his Italian accent still evident despite his transformation. "Until the gold returns to its rightful place," Mordecai Ironwood answered. "Until every piece stolen from the Aztec temples is returned to the gods who blessed it with power. Only then will the compact be fulfilled and the guardians released from their duty." Grimwald laughed bitterly. the sound echoing through the chamber like bones rattling in a coffin. And how many pieces are scattered across the territories? How many private collections and museum displays contain fragments of the original hoard? Thousands. Lysander Pike replied with scientific precision. Spanish conquistadors melted down most of the original artifacts and shipped the gold back to Europe. From there, it was traded, stolen, and redistributed across the world. Some pieces have found their way back to the Americas, but most remain lost in the private collections of wealthy men who have no idea of their true nature. The newest Guardians absorbed this information with growing horror. They were trapped not for years or decades, but potentially for centuries, bound to protect a treasure that could not be fully recovered in any reasonable span of time. There must be another way, Nightshade said desperately, his occult knowledge seeking loopholes in the supernatural contract that bound them, some ritual or ceremony that could break the curse. Atlas Stoneheart shook his massive head sadly. We have had years to explore such possibilities. The compact was written in blood and sealed with souls. Only the return of the gold can break it. As if to emphasize the futility of their situation, the chamber began to fill with the sound of distant hoofbeats. Another group of treasure hunters approaching through the desert night. The curse was spreading, drawing more victims to the whispering caves with each passing year. They come, Orion Graves observed, his glowing eyes turning toward the chamber entrance. More souls to feed the hunger of the gold. The 12 Guardians took their positions around the chamber, their spectral forms gaining substance as living prey approached their domain. The cycle would continue, as it had for 8 years, as it would for decades or centuries to come. The blood gold pulsed with renewed life, eager for fresh souls to claim. Martha Blackwood sat at her desk in the courthouse basement, surrounded by filing cabinets that contained 32 years' worth of missing person reports. All of them followed the same pattern: treasure hunters, archaeologists, or simple drifters drawn to the whispering caves by legends of Aztec gold. None had ever returned. At 60 years old, Martha had become something of a legend herself, the widow who dedicated her life to documenting and warning about the supernatural forces that haunted the Arizona desert. Her hair was now completely gray, her face lined with decades of worry and sleepless nights, but her eyes still burned with the same determination that had driven her to track her husband's killers all those years ago. The latest report lay open before her, a Harvard archaeology expedition that had vanished 3 months earlier. Professor Whitmore and his 6 graduate students, drawn by scholarly interest rather than mere greed, but claimed by the curse just the same. The Guardians made no distinction between treasure hunter and scholar. All who sought the gold paid the same price. As the clock struck midnight, ushering in the 20th century, Martha made her final entry in the official record. Case file Jine 1-24-7. Wetmore Expedition. Status: missing, presumed dead. Location: Whispering Caves vicinity. Cause: supernatural forces associated with cursed Aztec gold. Recommendation: permanent closure of area to civilian access. She closed the file and locked it away with all the others, knowing that her recommendations would be ignored, just as they always were. Men would continue to seek the blood gold, drawn by greed, or curiosity, or simple disbelief in forces beyond their understanding. And deep in the volcanic caves, the Guardians would be waiting. Martha had visited the caves one final time the previous year, driven by a need to see how the curse had evolved over 3 decades. What she found there defied description. Dozens of spectral figures now stood guard over the golden artifacts, an army of the damned bound to eternal service. The original 7 outlaws were barely recognizable among the multitude, their individual identities absorbed into the collective purpose of the Guardians. The curse had grown stronger with each soul it claimed, more demanding, hungrier for the spiritual energy of the living. What had begun as a simple protective measure by ancient priests had become something far more sinister, a supernatural trap that fed on human greed and desperation. As Martha prepared to leave the courthouse for the last time, her retirement finally approved after decades of faithful service, she composed one final warning for whoever would take over her files. To my successor, the Whispering Caves remain active and dangerous. The supernatural forces there show no signs of weakening and may in fact be growing stronger. Continue to monitor missing person reports in the area. Continue to issue warnings however futile they may seem. And above all, never allow yourself to be drawn by curiosity or scholarly interest to investigate the phenomena personally. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some prices are too high for any mortal to pay. The dead guard their treasure well, and they are always hungry for new souls to join their ranks. Martha Blackwood, federal investigator, retired. December 3rd. As she walked out into the crisp desert night, Martha thought she could hear something in the wind. Voices calling from the direction of the Whispering Caves, speaking words in languages that belonged to no living civilization. The sound was faint, almost inaudible, but it carried a message that she understood without translation. We remember, we wait, we hunger. The desert keeps its secrets, and some curses are eternal. In the depths of the Whispering Caves, the guardians of the blood gold continue their vigil, watching and waiting for the next group of fools to seek the treasure that has claimed so many before them. The 7 cowboys who vanished in 1867 had indeed found their legendary fate, not as the heroes of frontier ballads, but as eternal prisoners in a supernatural trap of their own making. Their horses and saddles, discovered 3 years after their disappearance, were merely the first clues in a mystery that would never truly be solved. For in the end, some stories have no resolution, only continuation. The Whispering Caves remain active to this day, drawing new victims with each passing generation. The curse adapts and evolves, but its core purpose remains unchanged: to guard the stolen gold of ancient gods until the end of time itself. And somewhere in the darkness, the spectral forms of Zephyr Blackwood and his 6 companions stand eternal watch, their mortal dreams of wealth and freedom transformed into an endless nightmare of servitude and despair. The desert remembers. The desert waits. The desert claims all who dare to steal from the dead.